Welcome everyone to NASEO's Severe Summer Weather Outlook webinar. I'm Megan Levy, co-chair of the Energy Security Committee, and I'm here with my co-chair, Ben Bolton.
Hello everyone, and welcome to the afternoon. It's a little change from all the COVID talk for a minute to talk about the severe weather and what's coming up. So we have a very packed agenda, and we'll start right in. If you do have a question, please enter it in the chat box, or we ask that you raise your hand using the app so that we can know that you do have a question and they can unmute your line. So to do that, make sure that you've called in using your audio pin, otherwise they won't be able to identify you, since we have fortunate to have so many people attending. So our first speaker is Dr. Jerry Bell, the meteorologist with NOAA's Climate Prediction Center. I'm happy to have him and welcome him to tell us about the Atlantic season hurricane outlook. So with that, Dr. Bell, I'll turn it over to you as we switch over to the presentation.
Okay, thank you, and it's a pleasure to be here. I'm going to click Show My Screen. Can you see my screen?
We sure can.
Great. Okay, let me just... Well, hurricane season is here. I've done these talks for several years now for NASEO, and there's always been a lot of interest, and I'm going to keep that interest again this year because we're predicting another above normal season. Let's see, for some reason my screen isn't... For some reason, my screen isn't advancing. There it goes. Okay. So anyway, I'm the lead seasonal hurricane forecaster. I work with the Climate Prediction Center, part of the Weather Service, but these forecasts are made with a lot of collaboration from forecasters at the Hurricane Center and also Hurricane Research Division. And the number one line is, regardless of the outlook this year or any year, it's important that you prepare for every hurricane season, regardless of the outlook, because we all know it only takes one storm to strike your area to make for a very bad year for you. So to kind of put things in a frame of reference, these are a historical set of storm tracks for the Atlantic Basin. And what I'm indicating in the yellow box is called the main development region. That's a key area of the Atlantic Hurricane Basin where, if it's going to be an active season, you're going to have a lot of activity in that yellow box. If it's going to be less active season, you're going to have less activity in that box. I'm indicating a typical storm track for hurricanes that form in the main development region. They typically move westward and northwestward, and then recurve off to the northeast, stay mainly out to sea, and are essentially a maritime type of issue. There's another set of storm tracks where they head almost due westward through the Caribbean Sea and into the Gulf of Mexico. Once they get into the Gulf, they're going to make landfall because the Gulf is essentially surrounded by land. What happens during more active seasons, you see that red arrow shifting westward. The hurricanes have a much longer westward track because conditions are more conducive to hurricanes over a much larger region of this main development region. And as a result, the threat of hurricanes striking the U.S., and in particular the Atlantic coast, goes up. This year, we're predicting an above normal season with a 60% chance. That's a lot of activity. We're expecting 13 to 19 named storms, and that when a storm gets named, it's got maximum sustained winds of at least 39 miles an hour. Of those, we expect 6 to 10 to become hurricanes. That's 74 miles an hour or greater wind speed. And of those, we expect 3 to 6 to become major hurricanes. And those are wind speeds of 111 miles an hour or more. And obviously, the centers of these ranges are well above the long-term averages of about 12 named storms, 6 hurricanes, and 3 major hurricanes. Now, we've already had 4 consecutive above normal seasons, so another above normal season would set a record for 5. But also remember now that the outlooks, as I've mentioned in past briefings for this group, the outlooks are for the overall seasonal activity. They're not a hurricane landfall forecast. And the reason is that where a hurricane strikes, how strong it is when it strikes, how many strike, all those issues are really related to the weather patterns that are in place at the time that the storm is approaching. And those weather patterns just are not predictable more than about 5 days in advance, let alone months in advance. So to put this hurricane season in perspective with what we've been seeing for a number of years now, this is what's called the ACE index, or Accumulated Cyclone Energy Index. It's a measure of the overall seasonal activity. And it's a good measure because it accounts for the combined intensity and duration of all the tropical storms and hurricanes during the season. So I'm showing the seasonal ACE value here back to 1950 for every year of 2019, and then the outlook for 2020 in red. So where the bars extend up into the pink area, that's what we call an above normal season. Where they stay in the yellow area, that would be a near normal season. And where they stay down in the blue, that would be a below normal season. This year, obviously our red bar extends well, most of the red bar is into the above normal season range, and it even extends up to what we call extremely active or hyperactive. And that's one of those seasons where you just have an awful lot of major hurricanes, and the threat of landfalls even goes up higher. So we're predicting another above normal season, possibly a record 5 consecutive, and you see the ACE values for the last 4 years all in the above normal range. Looking now back to put this outlook into more perspective, we've been in what's called a high activity era for Atlantic hurricanes since 1995. Since 1995, almost 70% of the seasons have been above normal, and only 4 have been below normal. It looks like this year is going to be in another above normal season, reflecting the ongoing high activity era. We saw a similar high activity era back in the 50s and 60s. But in complete contrast, and this is how these climate patterns go, you have a prolonged period of high activity, then a rapid drop to less activity, and then it'll switch quickly and you go to more activity. Well, the low activity era was 1971 to 94. During that 24-year period, there were only 2 above normal seasons. So we're not in that era anymore. Instead, we're in the period where we're consistently seeing more above normal seasons. Historically, these high and low activity eras have lasted anywhere from about 25 to 40 years. We're 25 years now into this high activity era. There's no indication at all that it has ended for this season. In fact, it's one of the predictors for an above normal season again this year is this continued high activity era. There's no way to predict how much longer it's going to last, but at least it looks like it's going to again persist through this season. This is a similar map, but it's showing the seasonal numbers of major hurricanes. And remember, those are the categories 3, 4, and 5 hurricanes on the hurricane scale with 111 mile an hour winds or stronger. So again, you see the 1950s, 60s were a high activity era. We averaged about 3 major hurricanes a year. During the subsequent following low activity era, the number of major hurricanes were cut in half. And there were only a handful of years here that even had 3, let alone 4, 5, or more. Of course, since 1995, we've been averaging about 3.5 major hurricanes a year. And the outlook for this year in red, again, is consistent with that ongoing high activity era of many, many seasons seeing 3+ major hurricanes. So the idea is, in general, we're seeing roughly double the number of major hurricanes during these high activity eras, and we're still in one. Not only do we see more hurricanes during high activity eras, but we see more landfalling storms. And this is reflecting that red shifted arrow that I indicated earlier, more storms are lasting longer, they're tracking farther westward, hence they're an increased threat to the United States. So this is a map of the U.S. hurricane landfalls. On the left is for the entire U.S., Atlantic and Gulf Coast, during high activity eras in blue versus the low activity era in red. And roughly, if you look at both coasts combined, there's about a 35 to 40% increase in the number of landfalling hurricanes per year. The biggest percentage increase is along the Atlantic coast, where we have almost a doubling of the number of landfalling hurricanes. While the Gulf Coast on the right does see more hurricane landfalls, the percentage increase isn't that much. Bottom line is, on average, roughly a hurricane strikes the Gulf Coast almost every season. Now, if you look at seasons that have multiple hurricane landfalls, this would be, say, one hurricane strikes the Atlantic coast, another strikes the Gulf Coast. That would be multiple, more than one landfalling hurricanes. We see almost a doubling of seasons with multiple landfalling hurricanes during high activity eras. We see about one every other year compared to about one every fourth year. So that's why understanding the climate patterns and what the forecast is so important. It really points to, hey, we need to get ready for the hurricane season. Now, it turns out that we're able to make seasonal hurricane outlooks mainly because there's global climate patterns that strongly influence the hurricane conditions in that main development region, oftentimes for months or seasons, or as we saw with the high and low activity eras, for decades at a time. So by predicting these climate patterns, researching them, understanding the patterns and so on, by ultimately predicting them, you can often predict the key hurricane influencing conditions and therefore make a confident statement of what the upcoming hurricane season will bring. One of the major factors that we look at, that these climate patterns are related to and that we look at, is the vertical wind shear. The wind shear refers to the change in wind speed and direction as you go up through the atmosphere. So on the top here is a schematic of kind of looking sideways through a hurricane. I'm indicating the eye wall. That's the deep thunderstorm clouds that go all the way up 40, 50,000 feet. And then the eye is what's in the center. And I'm indicating here just an example of the winds in the upper atmosphere and the lower atmosphere. And just here, they're both out of the east of roughly the same magnitude. So in this case, there's weak wind shear. This is a situation that allows hurricanes to develop. And what we see during these more active seasons is weaker wind shear over much more of that main development region. When you have an area of weak wind shear, that's when you get the strong hurricanes, the major hurricanes. And this is what a major hurricane looks like from a satellite picture. This is the major hurricane striking the eastern U.S. Now, in contrast, if there's strong wind shear, that can either, if a hurricane moves into an area of strong shear, it'll either get ripped apart, or strong wind shear will prevent storms from developing to begin with. So this is a scenario of what the clouds look like in a strong wind shear environment. So I'm indicating the clouds don't extend as high up into the atmosphere. The eye isn't as well defined or anything. And here I'm showing the upper level wind direction is opposite of the lower level wind direction. So that's an example of strong wind shear. That's what rips apart storms. And when you see a storm move into a strongly sheared environment, the satellite picture shows at the bottom is one. I'm indicating the upper level clouds. They're completely displaced from the low level cyclonic circulation that was once a hurricane. This is the wind shear ripping apart a storm. So when you hear on the news, the Hurricane Center is saying the storm has entered a region of high shear, it's weakening, and it looks like it's getting sheared apart. This is the picture that they're talking about. Unfortunately, this year with weaker shear, we're expecting more and stronger hurricanes. In fact, we're looking at possibly reinforcing factors for this hurricane season. I'm showing on the left here, this is a schematic. It's called the Atlantic Multidecadal Oscillation. This is the climate pattern that produces those high activity eras for Atlantic hurricanes. And its opposite phase, the cold phase, produces the low activity era conditions. So this turns out this AMO is the main driver behind those decadal variations in Atlantic hurricane activity that I showed you earlier. This pattern features warmer water and weaker wind shear across the main development region. It also features, and very importantly, a stronger and wetter West African monsoon. And when you have a stronger monsoon, that allows for the wind, the cloud systems that come off of Africa and eventually become most of the hurricanes and major hurricanes, it allows them to much more easily develop as they move across progressively warmer water and weaker wind shear. So the bottom line is that this particular pattern sets up an interrelated set of ocean temperature, wind, and air pressure conditions that all of which favor more and stronger hurricanes. Now there's another climate pattern that's also important in the hurricane prediction process, and this is the El Nino La Nina cycle, and it's mainly affects year-to-year hurricane activity. El Nino and La Nina refer to a climate pattern that's centered over the tropical Pacific Ocean. El Nino refers to, which I'm not showing here, refers to when the conditions are warmer than average. El Nino increases the wind shear over the Atlantic and suppresses hurricane activity. We're not expecting this El Nino this year. We're not expecting anything to suppress the ongoing high activity era conditions. In fact, what we're seeing is conditions now are starting to trend toward La Nina. La Nina refers to when it's cooler than drier over the eastern half of the equatorial Pacific. And the way the La Nina works is its downstream wind patterns mean weaker upper level westerly winds over the main development region. That means weaker wind shear. So when you have a combination of La Nina and a high activity era, that's when your probabilities of above normal season and potentially extremely active season really go up. So for this year, we're expecting above normal activity because of the ongoing high activity era and the warm phase of the AMO. But there's two scenarios that our outlook is reflecting. One is that the current ENSO neutral conditions, or neutral conditions, meaning no El Nino or La Nina, neutral conditions continue through the season. Nothing is there to suppress the activity. However, the other scenario is if La Nina does develop, that would reinforce the ongoing high activity era, and as I mentioned, likely produce or possibly produce activity near the upper ends of the predicted ranges. Well, let's boil this down to brass tacks as far as preparedness. 80 million people are along the Atlantic and Gulf coasts of the U.S. are in a position where they can be impacted by a tropical storm or hurricane, in part because we know some of these storms can track so far inland and produce tremendous flooding, down power lines, down trees, and so on along their path. This is a picture of Hurricane Michael from as a major hurricane made landfall in the Florida Panhandle just 2 years ago. Picture this as a map. Look at the scale of Hurricane Andrew. Hurricane Andrew makes little towns and things like that look like little dots. Basically, we are little dots as far as a hurricane is concerned. They affect and can affect millions or tens of millions of people along their path. Well, this becomes even more important, not only because we're in a high activity era, but because the coastal populations have grown so much over the last century or so. And this is a time series of the Florida coastal population of the state of Florida back to 1900. So you can clearly see that in the last 50, 60 years, we've had exponential growth, nothing slowing it down, and now we've got about 19 million people live in Florida. This is true of the entire Atlantic coast and Gulf Coast. Well, now I'm overlaying the low and high activity eras for Atlantic hurricane seasons. So it turned out early in the 1900s, from about 1900 to 25 or 1930, we were in a low activity era. Then the population started growing quite rapidly during the 50s and 60s. We were in a high activity era. Then we went back into that low activity era that I've mentioned a couple of times. Coastal population still growing. You hear developers saying, "Oh, we don't get the hurricanes striking like we used to. We can build up the coast." So they did. Now the coastlines have continued to build up. Now we're in a high activity era again for the last 25 years. That's now followed, decades of exponential growth. And as a result, as I mentioned, so many more millions of people are potentially threatened every time, or potentially impacted every time a storm threatens. This is Major Hurricane Dorian, and it's not just about the storm actually making landfall, it's that threat itself. This is last year. This is Major Hurricane Dorian stalled over the Grand Bahama Islands. You can see what's left of its eye, winds of 155 miles an hour, heavy rainfall and rain bands extending well out from the circulation center. It was a slow-moving major hurricane and ultimately reached 185 miles an hour. Slow-moving storms, stalled storms, they wreak havoc. And that's because instead of getting 10 or 20 inches of rain over a certain area, now you may get 30, 40, 50 inches of rain. We saw that with Hurricane Harvey in Texas in 2018, just a couple of years ago. Massive widespread flooding was its major impact. Dorian's impact was, well, I want to back off for a second. Here, Dorian's eye was 90 miles from our Florida coast. And this highlights why we can't really predict the landfalls on seasonal timescales, because were the U.S. not very fortunate, Dorian could have easily made landfall on the U.S. coast had it not stalled. Unfortunately, the Grand Bahama Islands and Abacos Islands were in entire storm surge region. Dorian destroyed everything. So that's how little distance it means it can take between complete destruction and getting away lucky. Regardless, we still had to prepare along the East Coast as Dorian was approaching, because there was certainly the potential threat of a major hurricane landfall was there. So the key message is you got to prepare for every hurricane season, regardless of the outlook. We all know it only takes one to strike your area to make for a very bad year. There's a couple of great websites that are out there, ready.gov from FEMA and hurricanes.gov from the National Hurricane Center. They really are great at helping you think about the conditions, way storm can impact you, and things that you want to think about ahead of time so that you're ready if a storm threatens. Because we all know trying to panic prepare while this major hurricane's approaching is just very unsettling. You want to do it ahead of time so that you're ahead of the game. And remember, you are your first line of defense if a hurricane strikes, not the government. You are. Now focusing more on storm surge, this is what basically the Bahamas were like with Dorian. Storm surge destroys everything. Storm surge is the ocean coming on shore with the hurricane. So you're no longer, it's not a rain area, it's the ocean itself with very big waves, very strong winds. And it, like I said, storm surge destroys everything. Turns out about 22 million people in the US are vulnerable to storm surge along our Atlantic and Gulf coasts. What we have now, and you should be aware of, is a predicted storm prediction map. And this is just an example. And this comes out of the National Hurricane Center. But it's just an example of, for a generic hurricane. Here's Houston over on the left. And what it's indicating in the shading is the different levels of water that you can see above ground. So in this particular example, you're looking at 9 feet of water above ground. That's above the ceiling of your house. Normal ceilings, if you look up to the drywall on your ceiling, that's about 8 feet. That means you're underwater. House is gone. So this is a great thing to know about, to check on ahead of time so you can see where you are as far as the predictions, to keep yourself abreast of the updated predictions. So as I mentioned, your hurricane preparedness plans, they need to reflect several things. Certainly they need to reflect your personal situation, kids, dogs, elderly, etc., your vulnerabilities, and also the types of storm conditions that you might expect. Maybe you live along the coast and you're in a storm surge area and hence an evacuation area. You need to evacuate if you're told to do so. However, maybe you live far enough inland where storm surge isn't an issue, rather it's the inland flooding. And you can get tremendous rains, 10 and 20 inches, even from a slow-moving tropical storm. You need to be prepared for that. Maybe you're inland where maybe your biggest impacts are devastating winds, down trees and power lines where you may be without power for a week. You're staying at home, you haven't evacuated, but you've got no power. You need to be ready. Hurricanes also produce tornadoes, and we all know about rip currents with those huge waves. You need to think about the ways you might be impacted. So one of the things to think about is to know for your hurricane preparedness plans is to know if you're in an evacuation zone or a flood zone. There's great products out on the web now, and this is an example I just pulled up. The internet shows evacuation and flood zone maps for your area. Take a look at it, get familiar. Some people, well, I live by a river, but I'm not a flood zone. Well, no, 15 or 20 inches of rain over a widespread area could quickly put that river in your house. If you're in an evacuation or a flood zone, make sure you've got important papers ahead of time. First thing you might want to consider is getting flood insurance, because normal insurance does not cover flooding. FEMA has a flood insurance program, and I believe other homeowner insurance programs do as well. But like I said, your regular homeowner's insurance does not cover floods. Make sure if you're in an evacuation zone, get your key documents, your deeds to the home or whatever you have, medical insurance, your driver's license, and so on, whatever you're going to need, so that when it is time to come back, you have documents that can say, hey, I do live in that area, I can get back in, or what have you. Make sure you have cash on hand. ATMs don't work when power is out. Think about where you'll go. According to FEMA, if evacuating to a family or a friend's house inland is generally much more palatable than to try and find a hotel room during a storm or even a shelter. Shelters are bare basic things. They're designed to keep you from dying. They're not designed to keep you comfortable. How are you going to get there? Think about that ahead of time. Would you use a car? Make sure your car is filled with gas. Maybe you live in an inner city area where your only hope is bus routes or something, or mass transit to get to a shelter. You need to know those things ahead of time. Don't forget about the kids. Make sure you've got plenty of whatever they need. Diapers, games, treats. Happy Kid makes for a much better time for a terrible situation that you're going to be in. Make sure you're addressing other special needs with your plans. And remember the pets. Make sure you've got prescriptions, medications, whatever you're going to need filled ahead of time. Make sure you have plenty of toiletries, because you could, if a big flooding situation, you might be out of your house for a week or more. If you're staying at home, again, remember the kids and pets. Make sure they've got their needs satisfied. One of the most important things is hygiene products, bathroom tissue, hand sanitizer, antibacterial towels, and so on. You're going to need them. Light is critical. You're going to have, you may be a week without power. Have flashlight and plenty of batteries. But what's even much better, and I use these, they're like a LED camping light. They're like $15. They put out a lot of light. They use very low battery, and they'll light up a room really nicely. And it's so much better when your power goes out having one of these on than a tiny little spot flashlight. Have a weather radio on hand so you can keep abreast of emergency management issues, evacuation zones, changing zones, what have you, as the storm evolves. Make sure you have rain gear. You're going to be in a flood zone, perhaps. A lot of rain down trees. First aid kit, duct tape. Things break. Duct tape can help keep you out of a fix sometimes. Fill your bathtub with water. You're going to need it for rinsing off things, but also it's a great way to backfill the toilet if you're on a well, for instance, and your well pump doesn't work. Also, a lot of things regarding food. Make sure you have paper plates, plastic utensils, hand can opener. You're going to be using these, again, if you don't have power and don't have running water, you're going to have a mess. Canned goods, plenty of canned goods, beans, soups, fruit cocktails, and so on. They last, plus they can get you through. The old standby peanut butter and jelly and whole wheat bread, that works. Make sure you have plenty of water. They say have roughly a gallon of water per person per day. A 12-pack of bottled water does not cut that. Cheese and crackers, nice consumable. It lasts, it cuts the hunger and so on. Nuts, granola bars are great. Cereals are great. Even fresh fruit, that'll be eaten first usually, but hey, it's food. Make sure you have trash bags because you're going to go through a lot of more disposable stuff than you might normally go through. So in summary, then, we're looking at another above normal season, unfortunately. We're looking at 13 to 19 named storms, 6 to 10 hurricanes, and 3 to 6 major hurricanes. And the key message, prepare for every hurricane season regardless of the outlook. Because again, it only takes one. Now is the time to get yourself ready and take action. So I'll stop there.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Bell. Do we have any questions in the chat, Shamika or Campbell? If not, I want to thank you for just a really well put together presentation. I guess I have a quick question. It seems like our ability to predict these storms is getting better and better. But how do we know? It seems like they're bigger and they're slower these days. Is that because of climate change or changing ocean conditions? Can you expand on that?
Yeah, it's really linked to that warm phase of the Atlantic multidecadal oscillation. That's the pattern that's producing the whole set of conditions that allow for stronger and longer lasting hurricanes. Now, the last couple of years, in addition to that, if you look at the weather patterns, we've had a big ridge of higher pressure in the upper atmosphere at jet stream level over the western Atlantic. What that's meant is as these storms move westward, they move into a region of weak shear and weak winds. That's a classic scenario for allowing for even stronger storm and slower moving storm. But if you remember prior to that, for almost a decade, we had no landfalling major hurricanes, and that was because the jet stream was farther south over the eastern U.S., and it was taking a lot of these storms out to sea. So there's these actual weather patterns themselves are crucial as far as determining exactly what we're going to see along the coast. And that's again why these types of actual landfalls just are not predictable this far in advance. We just cannot predict those patterns months in advance.
Yeah, thank you. That makes a lot of sense. And
Megan?
Yeah.
Hi, this is Shamika. We've got 4 questions. I'll just read them off. The first is from Michael Hornsby. He's asking, is there a good weather radio phone app?
I don't know. You'd have to track that down. I know NOAA has various apps. There's hurricane tracking apps, radar map apps, and so on. I'm not really an app person, so I can't answer that. But I'll bet if you looked, you'd find something.
Great. Next question is from David Terry. What impact, if any, does the Gulf Stream current along the coast of Florida have on hurricane direction or intensity?
It can impact hurricane intensity, all other things being equal, because you have warmer water, so you can allow that deep tropical convection to be more sustained. So it can play a role, but really the main player is just the overall weather patterns that are in place around the hurricane. That wind shear is a critical factor. Also, if a storm moves into a drier area, that can help weaken the storm. If it moves into a moisture area, it can help strengthen it. So there's a lot more going on than just the Gulf Stream per se.
Great. This is from David Alexander, should we read into anything that there have been 2 named storms before the official start of the hurricane season?
No. The peak of the hurricane season is August, September, October. That's when by far the bulk of the hurricanes and major hurricanes form. And those, by and large, form from tropical cloud systems moving westward from Africa. In contrast, early in the season, like during June and July, we typically average, if you include May, 1 to 2 named storms a year. Those typically form from a pre-existing frontal boundary that has some kind of jet stream link, and you get a more of a mid-latitude type of storm that eventually takes on tropical characteristics, and we name it. But that's really a completely different formation mechanism than what really controls the season as a whole. So no, I wouldn't make anything into it.
Great, thanks. And then last question I have is from Jeff Pillen. If anyone else has any questions, please feel free to either raise your hand or you can type in your question in the chat or the question areas on the chat of the control panel. So Jeff Pillen asks, can hurricanes affect areas not near the coast? A number of years ago, a hurricane hit Columbus, Ohio, with hurricane force winds?
Yes, and the answer is absolutely. Hurricanes often have a long inland track. It can be, as you mentioned, getting up into Ohio. Some of these Atlantic coast storms that make landfall get up into the Appalachian areas. So yes, and that was one of the main things behind this 80 million people are in hurricane-prone regions, and that's because of these long inland tracks that can produce 10 to 20 inches of rain over a very wide area, knock out power over very wide areas. So yeah, in fact, that's one of the most important. Inland flooding is one of the biggest causes of death now from hurricanes, in part because we do get people evacuated from the storm surge areas, because storm surge kills everything, destroys everything.
Great. One last question. With the increasing number of hurricanes, is it viable to reduce reinvesting in the affected areas and help people relocate to safer regions?
Oh, that's not one of my areas of expertise. You'd have to talk to town planners and people who know that type of thing. I'm not in a position to recommend any course of action other than if you're prepare now. Also, if you're asked to evacuate, make sure you're ready to evacuate and get out. Don't be stuck in a traffic jam or killed.
Okay. It looks like we have another question that just came through. Is it technologically possible or is there any research being done to keep a hurricane out at sea?
People have looked at this issue for decades, and the answer is no. There's no way you can. Hurricanes are massive. I mean, they span hundreds and hundreds of miles, and if you look at the low-level inflow to them and the outflow, that even spans hundreds and hundreds of more miles. So these are very large systems, and we normally just focus on the eye or the eye wall, but that's the strongest part of the storm. There's no way to impact or weaken a hurricane that I've ever seen, and nothing I've ever heard of makes sense, quite frankly.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. Megan, Ben, I don't have any other questions in the control panel.
Okay, thank you, Shamika. I will add, you might check with your emergency management agency. Ours, for instance, has an app that you can download that will act like a weather alert as well. So some states have that, emergency management agencies have that. With that, I'll turn it over to Megan.
Yeah, that's a great point. And just thanks again, Dr. Bell. Really nice presentation. I think even though we said we weren't going to focus on coronavirus or the global pandemic, the only update I might make to the preparedness portion of your slides would be that very few folks need a reminder to stockpile toilet paper now. But and I'm kidding, but it is also a good idea to think about protecting yourself and making sure that what does sheltering look like amidst a pandemic, amidst certain regulations. A lot are being relaxed now, but it's certainly a consideration. And I want to thank you for your presentation. I think it's very good and very informative.
It's a pleasure. Thank you. And yeah, the Center for Disease Control, I believe, has a lot of FAQs on their website, some of which address hurricane shelters and things like that. So another place to look at is the CDC website.
Yep, that's great. And I just put in a plug for those weather radios too. I know apps are great. Charge your phone. Make sure your phone is charged. But a good old-fashioned weather radio is just a real handy thing to have, and I'm old-fashioned like that. I believe in it. So with that, we'll move on to the summer fire outlook here with Brian Henry, who has helped us out before, I believe, with this. He's a meteorologist with the National Interagency Fire Center. And with that, I want to keep us on time, and we'll move it over to Mr. Henry.
Hi, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for having me, and thank you, Dr. Bell, for your presentation earlier. It's very informative. So my name is Brian Henry. I work at the National Interagency Fire Center in Boise, Idaho, and I'm the Predictive Services lead there. And if we could go to the next slide, I'll go ahead and get started. Before I actually launch into the presentation, I want to point out for those of you who might be interested in fire activity, we do have a podcast that we put together 3 times a week, Monday, Wednesday, Friday by 9:30 Mountain Time. And it can be accessed via this website you see listed on your page. On my last slide, I'll again show the web link if you want to copy it down. I'll also post our season outlooks as well in a podcast form. That's in the upper right corner there on those 4 blocks that you see. And then the actual text products are beneath it. Okay, if we can go to the next slide, we'll launch into the presentation. Okay, so when we look at each individual fire season across the country, we've learned that the fire season is actually a fire year. And what we start out with is what's been happening over the course of the fall, the previous fall that is. And so we canvass the country during the fall months to see what's going on. Where is drought developing? Where is abundant precipitation falling? And in some areas, abundant precipitation is actually maybe not such a good thing as you would expect it to be, and that it grows good grass crops like in the springtime, which gives you more fuel that's available to burn when it does dry and cure out. Likewise, drought is not necessarily a bad thing, but it usually is. We get a lot of drought over the desert. Sometimes that's not such a bad thing because you don't get as continuous growth of those fine fuels, and so there's not as much of it to burn when the fire season gets here. So most time, drought is bad, but not all the time. So we start out in the fall months, and then we kind of work our way around this diagram that you see before you. We go from the fall into the winter, and looking at this past fall along the West Coast, it was very dry. Had near record drought across Northern California and Western Oregon. It was dry up into Washington State as well. And that was a bit concerning because as those plants went dormant, they did not get the fall moisture that they need, that they uptake into to make them happy going through the winter months. So they were a bit drought stressed going through the winter months, and that was probably a bad start to everything. But as we went into the winter months, we had a pretty good snow year for the most part, especially on the Continental Divide, especially up near the Canadian border where it was above average. And snowpack accrual was very good for the most part, except for across Oregon and Northern California. South Central Alaska also experienced some significant snowpack deficits where they're down around 50% of average. But again, there are many factors that affect fire season severity, and snowpack is just one of the minor ones. It's actually what's more important than actual accumulation of mountain snowpack is actually what we call the spring factor. The spring factor is basically how quickly do we warm up, and also what is the magnitude of that warm up. And this year we warmed up a little bit sooner than average, and we had a couple of really warm events early on in the spring. And what that did was that jump started the melting of the mountain snowpack. So in the higher terrain, we started seeing early snowpack loss, early melting rates anyway, that accelerated with time. And so by the time we got to April, May, many of those areas that had deficits, those deficits were accentuated, and that became concerned in the higher elevations. On the flip side of the coin, in the lower elevations, it suddenly became very wet across Southern California. There was a period in early April that got like 400 to 800% of average precipitation over a 2-week period. Now, in the short term, that was a good thing because that got everything all nice and moist. But what that also did during that period of time is that started growing another really big continuous grass crop. At some point, that's going to become available to burn. We were thinking that it's probably going to be more of a factor for heading forward to the fall. And so as we go into the latter part of the spring, we're looking for the emergence of these high pressure ridges that really start to dry things out and heat things up. We're currently experiencing one right now, but it's going to break down tomorrow and move off to the east, and it's going to be replaced by a little wetter pattern for about a week and a half. And what that's going to do is that's going to push back the start date a little bit of our more significant activity to a normal start date as opposed to an early one. So that takes us up to the next factor, which is the June-July temperatures and precipitation. So right now, looking at Climate Prediction Center forecast and other data that we have available to us, we think that the second half of June and July are going to be well above average as far as temperatures go, and also a little bit drier than average on precip during the early part of the summer, and that sets the stage for our fire season, because the next thing that's up is the southwestern monsoon, which comes up from Mexico, usually around the first or second week of July, and gives lightning to the southwest, raises their humidity levels up, and actually slows down their seasons. But as those storms progress northward across the desert and across the Great Basin, they become a lot drier underneath them. So basically, other areas just get the lightning, and you can imagine that starts the fires. And so with a good grass crop in place, mountain snowpack loss early, things should be dry and receptive for fire activity come July and August with no problem. So we're expecting an overall above average season across the West. Do I think it's going to be a record setting year in the West? I don't think so. I think it'll be above average though. So there's a wild card this year, of course, we all know. I know last thing you probably want to talk about at this point in time is COVID. But that's kind of factoring into things as far as our planning goes, and how we're addressing that just from sitting in on conversations and listening to them, is that some of the things they're discussing to help the resources is maybe having the resources move like almost as like pods, like the different teams will stay basically isolated and connected to themselves throughout the fire season, and limiting outside contact with people outside the team as much as possible. So that should minimize risk of infection, we hope, with the teams. Also, another factor we're looking at too is possibly extending the length of the deployments for the teams as well. And they're still, I think, still working their way through that decision process as to whether or not they're going to do that part of it. So if we can move on to the next slide, we'll jump on and actually look at some of the data. Okay, the first thing is we're going to look at precipitation first over the last 90 days, and the last 30 days, and then the last 14 days. And looking at the last 90 days, you're still picking up on that precip bullseye over Southern California and Western Arizona, and it's still showing 200, 400% normal over the past 90 days. And again, that was from the precip that occurred in early April. Since then, it's rained very little out there, so it's actually been fairly dry. And the 30-day map kind of shows that. Looking elsewhere across the West, you can see that over the past 9 days, it was pretty dry, at least drier than average anyway, across the central and northern Great Plains and across the Great Basin and Pacific Northwest and Northern Rockies. And if you discount the last 2 weeks worth of data, it actually be stronger deficits that would show up. Because as you look at the 14-day map across the Pacific Northwest, Northern California, Northern Rockies, you can see it turned very wet. And that actually had a pretty good benefit to the vegetation out there that was getting quite drought stressed. But look at the big red area on that 14-day map across the Four Corners region heading into Southern California. It's gotten increasingly dry down there. And while they're expecting maybe a little bit of precipitation over the next week, it's not going to be enough to really turn the tide on things. So the fuels in that area are very receptive right now, and they should be. Entering June is the peak of their fire season down there. So if we can go to the next slide. Okay, looking at the next slide, basically there are different drought products we look at to assess things. We got the latest Drought Monitor in the upper left, and then something they call a drought change map. It looks at the changes in the drought classes, and this is over the last month. And then we have soil moisture information. I'll get to that in a second. And then on the bottom right, we have a drought outlook. Looking at the Drought Monitor, Basically, the precipitation that they've had across northwestern states has done little to impact the long-term drought conditions that are in place there. You can see areas of extreme drought that are still occurring despite the precipitation that's been received. And what I'm thinking, and I'll show you evidence for this in a second, is that all that precipitation they've gotten up there has basically gone straight up into the vegetation and not really into the soils too much. Although, looking at that soil moisture ranking percentile map below, it was actually looking a whole lot worse across Western Oregon and Western Washington, even Northern California just 3 weeks ago. What that map shows is basically a map of the last 100 years, and it ranks them by year. So that 20% would state that it's probably the 20th driest year over the last 100 years. 10 percentile would be this the 10th driest, and that's how to read this map. You can see Colorado looks really bad. Northern New Mexico looks really bad too. We are concerned about that, and there is some above normal fire potential up there for the next couple months until the monsoon arrives. But we're still keeping a close eye on that northwest coastal area. Looking at the drought change map in the upper right, basically what I would expected to see when this thing got issued yesterday was that we'd see more green areas, which would be indicative of drought reduction or removal. But again, the vegetation seemed to have taken all that moisture that fell for the most part. We've actually seen some expansion and intensification. We go to the next map, or next slide, please. Thanks. Okay, so that takes us to the fuels. Some of the fuels that we look at in fire dangerousness that we use to gauge how receptive the fuels are right now and where they may be heading are the 100-hour fuels. These are dead fuels that are roughly about 1 to 3 inches in diameter. 1,000-hour fuels are greater than 3 inches in diameter, so that gives you a size, an idea on the size of those fuels. Generally, what we consider critically dry is really about anything that's less than about 10%. So it's basically the orange or the orangish yellow shadings and the deeper orange shadings. Those are the areas where the fuels are critically dry. And on the 100-hour fuel moisture map, those will be a little bit more flashy and more able to change a little bit more rapidly than the 1,000 hours because it takes longer for the thicker fuels to lose moisture. But what you can see is that the Great Basin all the way up to, say, Salt Lake and into southeastern Oregon, maybe even parts of central Wyoming, they're all critically dry, and those fuels are receptive even into California despite the precipitation, at least as far as the 100-hour fuels go. Now, there's a bit more of a lag time with a 1,000-hour map, and you can see in Northern California it's still pretty green, even up into Oregon and Northern California, but there are areas in the Great Basin and the Four Corner States and West Texas and Trans-Pecos that are critically dry there as well. The ERC map is basically listed the energy that's available to burn in the fuels. Basically, the higher values indicate more critically dry fuels. Like the 1,000-hour fuel map, it takes longer to change, but it's a very good fire season indicator. Generally become concerned when we start seeing shadings that are in the orange and the reds there as well. And you can see that in the Northwest, Northern Rockies, they're just really not there. California's just not there yet either, but the Great Basin's kind of creeping into it. Northeastern Montana, Western North Dakota, they're a bit dry there, but they can quickly change since most of the fuels there are grasses, and the pattern that we're going to be under is going to promote a little bit more precip there. Northeastern Minnesota, New England, it's been a little bit drier than average there, and we have seen a little bit of an uptick in activity there, but it's nothing that's considered above normal. So we can go to the next slide, please. So here is a map that shows the thirst of the vegetation. Basically looks at evapotranspiration, and kind of we use that. This is a good proxy to show drought stress in the vegetation. The smaller map in the bottom center right basically is one I saved from back early in May, and it showed some rapidly emerging drought stress across the Pacific Northwest, Northern California. Florida was in bad shape at the time. It was having above normal fire activity, first in the southern part of the state and then latter during mid-month up there in the Panhandle, but things have improved there considerably. Across West Texas, New Mexico, Colorado, back in early May, wasn't too bad. It was getting a little dry. It hadn't rained in quite a while, but we were expecting things to get worse there. Now, fast forward to this map from May 23rd. This is the latest one we have available to us. You can see how things have evolved over time. The Pacific Northwest and Northern California has shown significant improvement in the vegetation, so that's buying us some time before we enter the peak of the season in the Northwest. It doesn't mean anything towards how severe the season is going to be, but it just buys us time. Meanwhile, across the Four Corner States and Nevada, you can just see how things have kind of gone into the tank there. The image speaks for itself. It's basically suggesting the fuels are pretty receptive, especially there in Colorado. Wyoming's coming into play as well, so we're watching that for potential above normal potential. Look up to Maine, New Hampshire, there's a little bit of dryness up there, but I think they're going to be taken care of today by some passing showers and storms. That'll help them out in the short term, and then there's also some stuff coming in the longer term. So if we can go to the next slide. Looking up to Alaska, this is traditionally the peak of their season going into June and early July, then they exit out of their fire season. And everything that we looked at so far for Alaska, aside from the snowpack that I talked about across the southeast that was way below average, would suggest that they are probably in store for an average fire season up there. And the reason for that is that long-range outlooks from the Climate Prediction Center suggest a higher probability for above normal precipitation, even though the temperatures are going to be above average. So the precipitation events should come frequently enough to help offset the conditions from becoming too severe. So looking at these indices, they use a system that's from Canada, so it's a totally different rating system than what we use down in the lower 48. And FFMC is basically fine fuel moistures. They're very flashy. They change very rapidly with really any precipitation. Buildup indices are actually some that's a little bit more stable that looks at longer term type conditions. And you can see the scales for each, basically the same thing. Oranges and reds are basically are bad, and greens and blues are good. So looking at these indices, we're starting to see them climb across the interior of Alaska and even to the southwest Alaska. And it's a little bit concerning, but historically, this is actually not too bad. A lot of times around this time of year in some seasons, you'd actually see BUI maps that look a lot like that FFMC map. So we're actually a little bit behind on drying of those fuels. So therefore, the activity has been pretty light up there. I've actually got some fire activity overlaid on this image. You can see down one on the Kenai Peninsula and then some right around the Anchorage area. But for all intents and purposes, fires that they get there should be easily manageable with these type of indices. But going forward, the long-term trend suggests that they will become pretty dry over the next week. We are expecting some significant lightning up there tomorrow and on Sunday, which is, and it's coming in an area in central Alaska where the fuels are a little bit drier, so we probably will pick up some fires there. In the lower center map there, that's basically precip over the last 24 hours and lightning strikes over the last 36 hours, and you can actually see the little small fires that are up there indicated on the map there. So again, Alaska, average fire season, no big significant concerns there. Move to the next slide, please. Okay, we talked a little bit about snowpack. I kind of want to give you a little visual on how things progressed. Looking back at the smallest map there in the lower left is the snowpack map. It's basically looking at the amount of water in the snow by basin across the west, and the first map here is from April 15th. You can see that you're looking at the scale and the colors on the map and the basins. Most part, everything's looking really good except for southwestern Oregon. There's one area in south central Colorado and a couple scattered in Wyoming, and the Sierra in California and the Rubies in Nevada were all below average, but again, nothing too bad. But as we headed later into April and into early May, we had a pretty hot event during, I think, this first week of May, where the snowpack melting rates accelerated greatly. You can see these deficits really starting up and starting to mount. So melting rates accelerated greatly. Along the east slopes of the Washington Cascades, which is a very fire-prone area, things got to be a little bit more concerning there as the melting rates accelerated there as well. And you can see across the Great Basin and into Colorado, things just start really going downhill quickly. And that became a pretty big concern for us, because as we continued to the present, you could see that snowpack is largely gone in most areas. When we start looking at these maps in the mid to late spring, we kind of start looking at them differently. So we stop looking at the actual percentages, and we start comparing one map to the previous one to how are those percentages changing? Are they dropping rapidly? And if so, that's a big concern. That means the snowpack's coming off more quickly. And that is in fact what happened in a lot of areas. So that was a good gauge to tell us what we could be in store for come July and August. So we can go to the next slide. Okay, looking at CPC outlooks for the 8 to 14 day period, and then contrast that with some precipitation forecasts across the south in the lower right corner. In the top left, you basically have the 8 to 14 day temperature outlook and 8 to 14 day precipitation outlooks, and suggesting overall cooler and wetter than average conditions across the Northwest and warmer than average conditions across Southern California. That's basically indicative of a trophy type pattern where there's a trough low pressure on or just off the West Coast, and that'll keep things pretty much as the status quo. None of these events are going to be exceptionally wet, but it'll be enough to help keep the lid on the fire season just for a little while longer. The high pressure ridge event that's affecting the West right now, that kind of moves out into the plains, and it really heats up and dries out over there. So those are kind of in areas that aren't so much fire prone this time of year. Northern Minnesota may get a little bit more precipitation, but their temperatures are also going to be up. Florida, we're not too concerned about that now because their sea breeze season is starting up and they're starting to get that afternoon convection, and they'll also continue to get a few weak frontal systems, maybe even an occasional tropical system coming across during that period, like maybe a little weak wave or something. But for all intents and purposes, it's looking pretty good now for Florida. Looking at the 10-day precipitation forecast across the country, basically this is cumulative, and this is just model data, straight model data. And basically I wanted to show you that most of the country should do fairly well with precipitation over the next 10 days. And except for Southern California, good chunk of Nevada, southwestern Utah, Arizona, and southern New Mexico, and the Trans-Pecos of West Texas. Those areas are going to remain very dry. And none of these precipitation amounts you see here are excessively wet. So benefits from this would only last about a week or two. So this would cover us in a lot of areas till about, say, end of the first week or second week of June. For excessive amounts, steer you down there to the Gulf Coast of Mexico. Those are amounts that would be excessive, like in the 8+ inch range, and we're just not seeing that in the CONUS. So we can go to the next slide. So looking at July, August, and September's maps from CPC, very little has changed from previous maps, indicating a higher degree of confidence, and other data we look at long range suggests this as well. You see the above normal temperatures and above normal precipitation, more probable for Alaska. That's good, so they should have a normal exit to their fire season. But the West, looking hotter and drier than average across a lot of the areas. And when we look at the historical record, that takes us back to 2007 is the closest year that we can find an analog to. And that was a very hot summer across the West and a pretty significant fire season. Go to the next slide. Okay, in summary, to summarize things by region, again, Alaska average fire season, they're into their season now, and it's gonna be a slow ramp up into their season, and then probably a pretty regular exit out of it. I'm not really seeing anything too concerning there. Pacific Northwest, we're looking for a normal start to the core of their fire season as opposed to the early start that we were expecting earlier, and we're expecting a hot, dry summer up there, so that'll be concerning, and areas most susceptible will be all of Oregon and the eastern 2/3 of Washington. Looking to California and the Southwest, Northern California should probably come into play about the same time that Oregon does. And Southwest, which will be about the time the Southwest is thinking about coming out of their season with the arrival of the monsoon. Not too concerned about Southern California during the summer months. That's more of a fall concern this year, I think. That grass crop dries out and cures out. We're thinking that that could be a pretty interesting Santa Ana wind season come this fall. La Nina falls tend to be fairly dry in Southern California, and so when you get those wind events over those dry grasses, that could be a little problematic, but we'll deal with that much later. Looking at the Great Basin, should be a pretty active season over there as well. As the fields continue to dry out northward, they should be entering their peak season here shortly. Looking at the next slide, will take us up to the Northern Rockies. We're expecting a pretty normal season up there, especially on the Continental Divide, but as you get into northern Idaho, could be a little bit above average for their fire activity, although not by much. There'll be some carryover from whatever was observed over in Washington State and eastern Oregon. Rocky Mountain area, most areas of concern are southern Colorado and in parts of Wyoming. Remainder of the area is in pretty good shape. It could be above normal in their fire potential for the next 2 months, and then when the monsoon arrives, they should quiet down. Eastern area should be exiting their spring season. Minnesota is greened up, and the upper peninsula of Michigan, which has been dry, has just now gotten some precipitation, so they should be in decent shape there. And finally, in the southern area, Florida has actually improved a good bit. Areas down there around Melbourne are now starting to get a little bit more precip, and that they should be out of play here shortly. So that pretty much leaves us with West Texas. Now on the next slide, that sums it up monthly. On the next slide, will basically take us to June, which basically the last of the green up. The West finishes up their green up cycle. Fuels start curing and drying, and what we'll see is a gradual transition westward further into Arizona and northward into the Great Basin as the month progresses, and then into Northern California by early July, and the Pacific Northwest and Northern Rockies as well. And then late July and August will be the peak of the Western season, and there's gonna be a good bit of above normal potential out there for fires. And then September, we should gradually come out of the season like we typically do in most areas. And then on the last two slides I have, I think the next slide is going to be the maps. These are the Outlook maps that are going to be issued on Monday. So your second set of people to be able to see these. They're not official yet, but they will be on Monday. This is what we have. Green areas are below average fire potential, mainly due to lingering conditions from precipitation, and the reds are the aboves, and the whites are just normal activity. In the areas where you see the white shading, doesn't mean there's not going to be fires. It just means it's probably going to be a normal number of fires. So you can see the potentials out there for the Southwest for June, and the Southern Great Basin, southwestern Colorado, and then also late in the month, possibly across Northern California and Southwestern Oregon. You can see how things expand in July and August, and then refocus over the Northwest before the season ends. And finally, on that lower right, there's the website address. If you want to keep up with a podcast we issue Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays for the short-term next 7 to 10 day period, you can go to that site. And the Outlook podcast, those are issued twice monthly, generally around the 1st of the month and the 15th of the month. And that concludes that. I don't know if I have any more slides. I think that might be it. Okay, yeah, I think so. Okay, well, I appreciate your time and thank you for listening.
Well, thank you. That's very informative. Appreciate your slides. Shamika, do we have any questions in the chat?
Yes, we have a hand raised by Ruth McCormick. Ruth, you are unmuted. I think you self-muted yourself though, so you'll need to unmute yourself to ask your question. Ruth? All right, well, I will give her time to unmute herself, but in the meantime, we do have a question. Oh, no, it was just a comment from Justin Cochran saying, great presentation. If you do have a question, please enter it in either the chat pane or the question pane, or raise your hand and I can unmute you so you can ask your question directly to Brian.
Yeah, thank you for the presentation. It's a really great opportunity to be able to dig deeper into this data.
Thank you. I appreciate the opportunity.
I don't have any questions, Megan.
All right, then. Well, we'll thank Mr. Henry again. And with that, Mr. Bolton, I guess we'll move right along.
All right, thank you. As we're switching over to our next presentation, thank you again, Mr. Henry, for the presentation. It was really thorough and really great. I always enjoyed and learned so much every time we hear from your presentations. Next, we are going to have Angela Koppel, who's the EMAC Program Director with NEMA, National Emergency Management Association. As we did say, we're getting a little away from COVID, but we still couldn't possibly go through things without mentioning it. She's going to briefly talk to us about the summer and what impact that's probably going to have with EMAC. And if you're not familiar with EMAC, it's something that I definitely would recommend taking the time to do so. With that, I'll turn it over to her.
Great, thank you. Well, if you were like me while Dr. Bell and Mr. Henry were talking, I think pretty sure my blood pressure was going up every time I saw a slide that predicted more and more events going to happen over the next year. So thanks for that. And now I get to speak last while my blood pressure is at full peak. Next slide, please. We are fortunately still in the pre-event phase. We've not had any activations outside of COVID-19. EMAC is an all hazards, all discipline compact. Many people call it the Governor's Compact because it was started by the governors in Florida and then expanded to now include all 50 states, the District of Columbia, Puerto Rico, the U.S. Virgin Islands, Guam, and the Northern Mariana. So we do have some time right now to plan for EMAC missions as we look to decrease the spread of infections from COVID-19. If you could advance the slide, please. As you can see, states rely heavily on the EMAC system when they need assistance. So since 2016, nearly 30,000 people have deployed through the compact. To give some reference on the type of activity through EMAC, In the purple, you'll see states that requested and received assistance. And the slides are a little bit off a little bit. I see that the blue dot is for states that assisted but did not receive. And then the green states are states that both requested and received assistance. So EMAC is a great partner to states, going back and forth and sharing resources with one another. Next slide. During the 2017 hurricane season, over 45 states deployed over 18,000 personnel. And then that was at the same time while they were fighting fires and deploying resources through the fire season. We had earthquakes and our first EMAC volcano activation. And next slide. As we look on how to conduct EMAC missions in a COVID-19 world, it's critically important that we engage with governors now. We have been doing a lot of outreach with states and trying to get in front of the governors to ensure that states develop response plans that look at housing, distance workstations, and even how to physically distance delivery of meals to first responders. California, Colorado, and other states are doing this type of planning now, as well as Florida for the hurricane season and others. We're looking at how to bring in people that are not going to be impacted by living in close, cramped quarters, sharing meals, really anything that can bring people together. And that's even looking at some of the fire camps and how to decrease the number of people in each of the fire camps. And just checking if we lost the slides. Oh, here we go, they're back. States might also look at personal protective equipment, cleaning supplies, and disinfectants and have those available to anyone who's deploying. Have testing and rapid isolation procedures available for EMAC deployed personnel, along with provisions for quarantining personnel who test positive or have symptoms. We're working with states to develop plans and put in place agreements for the rapid testing and isolation of personnel. Again, we're asking states to do this now, establish the contracts with those who are testing and make sure that as soon as someone has symptoms, we can get them tested and then get them quarantined, even while they're on their EMAC deployment. Of course, the rapid and quick decontamination of equipment and materials that are going down to work on missions, we want those to all come back clean. And those, of course, can be included as costs on an EMAC mission. And then I'm providing safety information for working in and entering facilities. And we're also asking states to identify what parts of missions might be able to be conducted virtually. So very typically when EMAC is activated, a state will ask for an EMAC A team or advanced team to come down. That team helps them with bringing in EMAC resources. We're really looking to see if most of those teams would be able to be activated virtually with a core team within the State Emergency Operations Center. That will allow us to separate people from workstations, not work so closely together, but still be able to get the work done. And then relying on software more frequently to collaborate. So it's a little bit different looking sort of response for us, but I think we're open to any possibility where we could assist, especially on the virtual front. And next slide. When it comes to rostering personnel who would be deployed on an EMAC mission, we're looking at and asking states to identify people who are not at a high risk for severe COVID disease, and letting people opt out if they have concerns about going on an EMAC mission. So when looking at developing your mission ready package, a mission ready package is kind of everything you need to go conduct your mission, and it's put into our online system called the Mutual Aid Support System, or in the Excel template that we use, really to look at that roster, develop it, and your 35-person team might be down to 28 people once you've removed the individuals who are at high risk for severe COVID disease. And next slide. So again, we're looking at testing pre and post-mission personnel who are deploying on an EMAC mission, and monitoring for symptoms. Again, this looks at if you had personnel who deployed out of states, governor might require a quarantine when people return back to their home station. So that could be anywhere from 14 to 7 days of a quarantine. And I know that the National Guard is working on provisions to possibly limit the quarantine down from 14 days so people aren't out of commission for such a long period of time. Typically, EMAC missions are between 7 and 14 days on average. So if you then added on a 14-day quarantine, you could have people out for nearly a month. So that's a pretty long time unless they're able to work virtually upon return home. And next slide. As always, we recommend that people who deploy on an EMAC mission have access to crisis counseling when they come home. EMAC missions can be very stressful. You're going in to help somebody on their worst day, and the stress of that could often be where you need a little bit of crisis counseling when you get back home. But it's also extremely valuable because you're going into a situation that you might not have ever encountered in your state, and you're bringing what you learned back home with you, where you can improve your plans and procedures for what you learned while on your EMAC mission. And next slide. We want to stress that EMAC reimbursement must be a priority for everyone, everyone from the states down to the personnel who deployed. One of the biggest slowdowns we have in the EMAC reimbursement process is probably not where you think it is. You're probably thinking it's at the state level. It's actually not. It's usually at getting the reimbursement packages turned in, getting all the documentation turned in. It's really at that very first step. So once people deploy home from their mission, they should immediately try to compile their reimbursement packages, put together all the receipts that they have, get that up to their own agency. Their agency will then take their payroll when they have that, combine it with all the receipts and everything that everyone collected, and turn that reimbursement package over to their home state emergency management agency, who will do an audit and then push it off to the requesting state emergency management agency for reimbursement. And I'm sure that it would surprise most people to learn that after the 2017 hurricane season, 1 year later, over 70% of the reimbursement packages had still not been submitted. So it is a problem. We have been actively working to try to get reimbursement packages submitted in a more timely fashion so we can expedite the reimbursement process. We have updated our procedures, we've updated our templates that we use to track it, and we are building out a system where we can in more real time track the reimbursement process. So we're very focused on getting that moved through the process very quickly. And next slide. If you want to learn more about EMAC, you can go to our website, which is emacweb.org. And as always, I'm open for any questions that you might have about EMAC.
Thank you very much. I appreciate giving the update and letting us all learn more about EMAC and what an excellent resource it is for both states and NEAS. And it's also a great way for staff to get training in a situation they may not have faced, but could face is something. And so that's something that we certainly encourage. I will say that I have developed a draft mission ready package for ESF 12.
Excellent.
Yeah, we have one drafted and ready to sort of upload, but then of course the pandemic hit, so I was working with Florida to do that back and forth, and we were all set to exercise it. But of course, at the moment, we're limited on state travel and resources. So we'll still develop that, and that's still in the plan when things are a little more travel permitted. But that is something I probably will be back in touch, because I would certainly love your review.
Excellent.
With that, my first question was, you talked about isolation possibly after deployment. Would those costs be covered by the requesting state? Is that what you're saying?
So Right, so we are asking for those to be included in that offer of assistance. So whether it be 7 days or a full 14 days, if that individual is not able to return to their normal work, that those costs would be included in that deployment.
Okay, thank you. That was my question. Let's open it up. Shamika, are there any questions in the chat room?
Yes, we have a question from David Alexander. If an individual of the team or maybe two people test positive for the COVID-19 virus, would you quarantine the entire team or just that person or persons infected?
My guess is that a state would probably want to quarantine that entire team if they were in close contact with one another, and then test everyone after, my guess is probably 7 days. They'd probably retest everyone to see if they were able to return home. And I think that brings up a really good point, is that if you're on an EMAC mission, you could test positive while you're on that mission, on your way home, once you get home. I mean, there's a lot of different places where you could possibly test positive. So, you know, having provisions and having the state work on what are we going to do if we have individuals who test positive while they're in our state. You know, now not only do you have the people within the state, the people who had to evacuate some area, but you've also got the EMAC people who deployed, who probably now can't live in a base camp together. They have to live off on their own. So they need to be making provisions now for how they're going to address that type of isolation of personnel who are deploying into their state.
Great. If anyone else has any questions, please either enter it into the chat pane or question pane, or raise your hand and I can unmute you so you can ask the question directly. All right, Ben, doesn't look like I have any additional questions.
Okay, thank you, Shamika, and thank you again, Angela, for a great talk on EMAC. And with that, I will turn it back over to Megan.
All right, thanks, Ben. And yeah, thank you, Angela. That was really informative. I know Wisconsin is a big user of the EMAC system, but something Ben and I have been talking about in the lens of the Energy Security Committee is how to cross-train and how to create these, you know, mission-ready sort of packages so that when we do get the call, we can be as helpful as possible. So I really appreciate that overview. Now we're going to move on to our Federal Summer Emergency Preparedness and Response Overview with our good friend Kate Marks, the Director of Preparedness and Exercise. She's with the Office of Cybersecurity, Energy Security, and Emergency Response, aka the CSER office at the U.S. Department of Energy. And probably needs no introduction with this group, but thanks so much for hanging out with us every week, Kate. Excited to hear your presentation.
Great. Thank you so much, Megan, and thanks to NASEO for having us today. I'm pleased to be on this panel again with our federal counterparts and NEMA in order to be able to present to you all. So following the outlooks, we really wanted to get into today a little bit more about CSER, just to provide some background. Our role as the Emergency Support Function 12 response, and then look at some of the preparedness and response functions that we take on. I'll go through the overview of the 2019 season and how we're preparing for the 2020 season. And obviously, it's all COVID all the time, and I think that will remain as we move through the summer weather situation. And then we'll provide some state considerations at the end. So on the next slide, Campbell, this is just the mission of CSER. We were stood up to focus on emergency preparedness and coordination of response efforts, working with states, local governments, and with the energy sector across both electricity and oil and natural gas. And we really want to focus on the preparation and response to any situation that's going to disrupt the energy system. So this could be from a physical event, cyber attack, any type of natural disaster, which, obviously we're talking about much today, or man-made event. So, this is a mission that has been at DOE for some time, but obviously the elevation of cyber comes into play, but we still remain focused on the energy security planning work with the states, as well as that emergency response function. So Campbell, on the next slide, you'll see how we're broken into the different parts of CSER and what we cover within those. So on my team in preparedness and exercises, we're really focused on fulfilling the sector-specific agency responsibilities. And that's coming up from the National Infrastructure Protection Plan and some various authorities that exist. They kind of give DOE the role to coordinate with the energy sector and with state local governments with energy equities. And then as part of that, we obviously do the energy security planning with you all, providing tools and resources. We try to exercise those plans with you and with the sector. We're also focused again on that big piece of cyber preparedness, but obviously there's more time to focus on that another day. Emergency response and recovery is led by Ken Buell. I know a number of you know him and Matt Tarduano on his team. They provide situational awareness. They're constantly monitoring the system. They actually have been, fully activated for the last several weeks regarding COVID, and there have been a few other situations that have emerged, earthquakes. There was a scare of a potential hurricane, and so they're really there to ensure that the coordination in an event is happening, across the sector, across industry and government. So Campbell, on the next slide, I just want to kind of level set with everybody about, what the emergency support function is. So every critical infrastructure sector has an emergency support function and a related agency that oversees that function. So for ESF 12 Energy, the Department of Energy plays that role. And so we are coordinating across the agencies, DHS, FBI, FEMA, Coast Guard, and I can go on and on and on with, some of the agencies that we would be working with and that you might be hearing from, depending on what types of impacts may occur during an energy disruption. And I know that many of you on this call are actually serving this role of ESF 12 responder at the state level. And so you'd be working closely with our federal team of, regional coordinators. You may have ESF 12 responders from the federal government, DOE, sitting in your emergency operations centers. And we have about 100 people at the federal government level within DOE to draw from that may serve, some of those roles. So we are fully prepared to address, the situation we're currently finding ourselves in, where, this COVID response will continue, the COVID effort of recovery and kind of return to the workplace will continue as we move into the summer season here with hurricanes, wildfires, and the like. So on the next slide, this is just a little bit more depth on the activities that we take on the ESF role. So we're really looking to facilitate the restoration of damaged energy systems. This could be, downed power lines or, pipeline issues that may emerge from flooding or from, hurricane winds. We serve to provide technical expertise across the federal government with the states, and as well, I mentioned our regional coordinators. So at that regional level, closely working with the FEMA regional coordinating centers. And then we also collect and share energy sector information. So you'll see a screenshot here of one of the public situation reports that we released for Hurricane Dorian. I know many of you have been receiving the COVID situation reports that we've been sending out on a pretty regular basis, about twice a week. So we are doing situation reports when there is an incident. So you will see those coming through our emergency assurance and coordinators list. And we will talk about what that EEAC list is in just a moment. But again, the primary focus is really to provide that level of coordination with federal, state, and local agencies, as well as other emergency support functions across the critical infrastructure sectors, to eliminate any hurdles to restoring the energy system. So this may come at the level of trying to provide certain waivers or encouraging certain waivers. There also may be a need to, in past hurricane seasons, we've had a need for, high-level trucks, and so how do we make sure that we can, get, in flooding situations? So how do we make sure that we can get the right equipment? There's, going to be a big issue, I think, coming up this season with credentialing of different energy sector companies that may be coming into your state. It's similar to the EMAC process. All of the utilities have a mutual aid agreement where they, if they need help, they can provide that help through their mutual aid agreements. And so we really need to be thinking about some of, how we manage these processes. But we'll really be, helping to provide all of that and really, again, eliminate some of the hurdles and provide a liaison across a lot of these different entities. So on the next slide, Campbell, I just wanted to kind of talk through the steady state to activation levels between, the watch and the steady state, kind of where we are on an everyday basis, all the way up to the very significant and severe level 1. So under an enhanced watch or a watch and steady state, typically the Department of Energy and FEMA are not activated. When we get to the level 3, 2, 1 areas, there will be different levels of activation. It could be that they, activate all of the emergency support functions, or they just activate the emergency support functions where there may be an impact. So right now under COVID, for example, we were activated for the last several weeks. We're actually going to be moving into an activation that is not at the FEMA level anymore, but is just at DOE. So we will still have regional coordinators within DOE that will serve to work with the states, work with the federal government in really monitoring the energy system, and again, kind of serving as that resource. But we will not be activated under the FEMA provision for much longer. So, it really comes to pass in as we move into an emergency situation, during an emergency situation, and then kind of what the recovery looks like. And FEMA really makes all of those decisions for us. On the next slide, you'll see our fully activated response structure. People often ask us, kind of how all of this comes together. I think I mentioned the, more than 100 people that we can draw from, but there is a very basic set of people who will be involved throughout the process. So we have a fully staffed emergency and incident management council that includes several parts of the Department of Energy. So not only are we focused on the coordination, but we are also concerned with some of the facilities within DOE that we have to monitor and make sure that our people are safe and healthy, just like you do at the state level. And then our senior emergency or energy response official, that's going to be Nick Anderson. He's the Deputy Assistant Secretary for Infrastructure Security and Energy Restoration within CSER. And so he's integrating with our Congressional and Intergovernmental Affairs Office, providing any feedback to, the Hill and any high-level kind of gubernatorial interactions we might have. Public affairs, as well as the general counsel. So he really serves as the liaison internally to make sure that the messaging and the incident response is on point. At the energy response organization level, that is going to be Ken Buell. And I actually serve as his backup should he ever take a break, which he is not typically doing because he is a very hard worker and he kind of serves this position in a very robust way. So that on his team, he's got operations, planning, and what we call LFA focused people. So each of these different functions that you see here are going to be played, during an emergency situation. So where the states come into play is under that operational perspective. So the industry and association coordination, and the way that we see that is really in working with our energy emergency assurance coordinators. That is a group of designees, you'll see this a little bit later in the slide deck, that are assigned by the state to, kind of engage with DOE if there is an emergency situation. They can also engage with each other, in the lead up to or during any type of energy disruption. And then on the state front, that's kind of more broadly the interaction that we might have with, a group like NASEO or with a group like NARUC, where it might not be the energy emergency assurance coordinator or the ESF 12 responder, but maybe we're talking to somebody, who's the energy office director, and ensuring that kind of the messaging and the effort is really being shared across those boundaries. So Campbell, on the next slide, we just wanted to kind of give an overview of our 2019 activations. These were all of the formal activations. There may have been incidents here or there that we were certainly monitoring, whether it's a pipeline disruption or, anything else. But these were where we were activated under FEMA. We were activated for 79 days in 2019. We put out about 35 responders into the field. And then, our support staff were, fully activated through that time within DOE headquarters. We had 8 events, so there were hurricanes, tropical storms, typhoons, and some national special security events that you can see here. And we did deal with 12 named storms through that time. Obviously, 2017 and 2018 were a little bit of a different story. There were a lot more issues that we dealt with through those 2 years. But last year, this is what we were dealing with. And at the top there on the right, you'll see the green shirts, green hats. This is what any Energy Support Function 12 federal liaisons will be wearing when they show up in State Energy Operations Center. So you can keep an eye out for them. They'll be the ones in the green shirts. On the next slide, Campbell, we've got kind of a quick look at the way that we think about after action activities. So after every hurricane season passes, we typically all sit down, we go through a survey process with our federal agencies, with state agencies, and with our responders. And we look at some of the activities that we think we should sustain. What have we done well? What's working well? What do we want to continue? And some of the things in 2019 that we came up with in early 2020, when we kind of did that look back, were that we have really gotten to a point where we've brought in enough people at the response level within the federal government that have the expertise, and the recruitment has done, we've done a really good job of recruiting people who we can bring, to the states, to the regions, and to the national response coordinating centers that know what they're talking about when it comes to the energy sector, and really to provide that subject matter expertise that's required in that role. We also have our power marketing administrations. The PMAs provide energy across the country, and we've done a better job of really improving our integration with them as federal government entities. Other things you'll see here are just kind of the restoration to recovery planning. So how we move from one phase into the next, and the restoration of critical lifelines. There is a process under the federal government where we've established critical lifelines and really ensuring that we're kind of identifying those critical lifelines and demonstrating the status of those critical lifelines within the broader structure of response and recovery. And then finally, our situational awareness products. I think, the fact that we are providing those on a regular clip, really giving the information out about what DOE is doing, what the situation is, what the federal government is doing, and oftentimes what the states are doing, what waivers are out there, and how are we all working together, has been a really solid process. I think some of the things that we wanted to make sure that we were improving was some of the training for our own responders, and really making sure that they can do that virtually, because a lot of them are across the country. A number of them are in headquarters, but really being able to ensure that people have access to the training. One big element is on the cyber front. Cyber is it's not a new issue, but it's certainly emerging and evolving. And so ensuring that our folks have the background that they need to provide any subject matter expertise should a cyber attack come to pass. And, we've thought a lot about, in the event of a hurricane response, there may be adversaries who would be looking at our, kind of focused situation on the hurricane and maybe take advantage of that. And so we really have thought about this dual response in the past. And I just say that because I know that right now, again, we're going to be looking at the dual response to potential hurricanes impacts and wildfire impacts, and what that looks like under COVID. So again, a few of the other things here are just, thinking about resilient communications. How do we communicate? I know that Megan mentioned, after the talk about the question about the app, you really have to make sure that your phone is still able to get energy, power, so you can turn it on and really use that app. So how do we think about the communications that will be needed? And this is a little bit more of a technical area our Office of Electricity also engages in. And then just based on some of the 2017 and 2018 issues, really getting better about the island resource coordination and what that looks like, getting things down on paper, really working with the territories on some of their energy security plans is a big focus of ours in our office. And then finally, just looking at how we support ESF 12 outreach across the interagency. So, making sure people know who to contact, and the fact that, we are the energy specific agency, and that they can come to us for that subject matter expertise. I think, Campbell, going to the next slide, we wanted to just talk about the fact that, power restoration is not a black box. We couldn't find a similar chart on the oil and natural gas side. It may exist somewhere, but the point here is really that, the energy system is complex, it's complicated, and there is a very specific process as to how you bring it back online. And I think one of the biggest things that we see during a hurricane response is, especially from our government officials, and I know you all have to do a lot of communications up, right, to your governor, and they want to understand why this area isn't back up, or why one area comes up before another. And I think that, it's important to note that every electric company has a detailed plan for how they can restore the electricity system after a storm. So, while customers, or again, our government officials may not see line workers in their neighborhoods, it's really important to remember that there's a very heavy interconnection in the equipment that's needed to be repaired, of what's really causing the outage may be located in another area of the system. And if, any infrastructure needs to be rebuilt in order to restore power, this can delay restoration times. And so, I know that you all know this, but crews, are working day and night to bring power back on after a situation might emerge. And so, it's really important, as we think about the unity of effort across industry and government, as well as that unity of message, is really carried across. And so we try to help promote that for the energy sector, on behalf of the energy sector, to say, hey, we know crews are working too, and they're working all day long. We did want to also point out here, while we didn't see a kind of an exact replication of this step-by-step process on the oil and gas side, they do have a very helpful handbook that kind of describes what the oil and natural gas sector is doing to prepare for energy disruptions. And that's really across all hazards, but just kind of something to use as a resource for you all. On the next slide, these are just some informational resources that we have from the Department of Energy. So hopefully most of you are familiar with our Eagle Eye situational awareness tool. If you're not, you can certainly call up Shamika or Campbell or David at NASEO. I know Ben and Megan are also fully aware of this. You can give us a call at DOE as well. We can get you access to this very useful tool. It really provides the situational awareness across where the outages might be and other types of information that you might need to just really try to understand what's happening during an energy disruption, and really be able to explain that to the people who might be asking you questions about what's going on and what's really happening. Another key resource is obviously our Energy Information Administration. Kind of tracking with them on a regular basis is key, but also they do now have a special disruptions website, and they also put out their regular petroleum reports and energy outlooks. And I know that NASEO provides you all a really great linkage to those as well. And then finally, we do talk about Gas Buddy as a great resource during an energy disruption. I think we've all talked about, should we point to Gas Buddy, or should we try to, create this on our own? But we've really found that Gas Buddy has been a really great partner with the government at the federal and state levels. And so, we continue to kind of point to their tracker in a way to, share the information about what gasoline stations might be open or closed. All right, so quick time check here. It looks like we're at 4:45. All right, so on the next slide, the federal pandemic guidance, we just wanted to provide, a quick point to the COVID considerations. This resource here just came out. It's something that the CDC put out on considerations for shelters during the pandemic. And this includes both wildfire and disaster shelters. So hopefully you all have seen this, and there are links to this within our Department of Energy frequently asked questions that I know many of you are familiar with, because we've talked about these on a weekly basis during the COVID calls. On the next slide, Campbell, you'll see reference to the Energy Subsector Coordinating Council's resource guide, as well as information from the oil and natural gas industry on their recovery considerations. I just wanted to point to those from the energy sector perspective about how they're thinking about the return to the workplace and the recovery of the oil and natural gas sector. And then the pandemic considerations that you'll see listed, those are really things that we've been thinking about at the Department of Energy with regards to our ESF-12 responders. So, as we move into hurricane season and, any response or interagency coordination we'll be doing on the wildfires front, we really need to be thinking about how our response team will be affected by the pandemic. And so these are just some of the considerations we've come up with. I won't go too much into these because I know, we've kind of touched on them, but it really is important to think very deeply about what this will mean for a response and make sure, I think what we would like to do is work with you all at NASEO within some of the states that, may be more heavily impacted by a potential hurricane, work with the territories and work with maybe folks in the Northwest to really evaluate what you all are doing at the state level to manage some of these issues and how we can help communicate that to the energy sector as it's helpful. So we can certainly take this and kind of run with it. And we'll be back in touch with you all on this. On the next slide, just real quick, the Energy Emergency Assurance Coordinators Program. Again, I know many of you are receiving situation reports through this. If you are not currently an Energy Emergency Assurance Coordinator and you want to be, you can reach out to us, you can reach out to NASEO, and we can help you work through the process of gaining access to that. One of the unique things we did this time around with COVID is actually set up a SharePoint site, and we're providing a number of resources to the EEAD through that site. And then again, this is just kind of a distribution list, a listserv that you can use to work with your partners at the state level and then provide information to us as well. So from a hurricane perspective, we will work with the states or territories that may be affected by a hurricane, for example, and let them know in advance of a hurricane how many outages they might experience. We kind of do analysis that will tell us, where they might see a specific impact. And so really connecting into that can kind of give you an extra level of detail that we think is necessary in terms of the response. And the next page just kind of gives a little bit of the EEAC coordination and communication. Again, you guys can look at this, but it's really critical to think about this as a two-way information sharing platform. On the next slide, here's one of the most important things that I want you all to get out of this presentation. This is the state checklist. These are the things that you can go do as you have time in preparation for the hurricane season. So getting your Eagle Eye validation or login information validated, trying to gain access to the EEAC and the related ICERnet platform so that you can talk to your peers across those listservs and with us at the DOE. Reviewing the energy waivers library. This is something that we've been trying to update on an annual basis or even more frequently. What are the waivers that you can request? How do you get them? Knowing who your regional coordinator is, on the next page, you'll see the map. And we can help communicate with them as well. Making sure you're connecting with your state emergency management agency. I think it may also be important, again, under COVID, to think about your healthcare or, other agencies that might be involved and can help kind of move through the process of what the energy sector might need to be thinking about in your state. And then finally, the CSER website as well as our Hurricane Hub are now live, and you can get the DOE situation reports there during an emergency situation. You can also get access to, other information. And one more point, under coronavirus, we do have a coronavirus hub. So all of those things are available. We're trying to point to federal government and other information that may be useful in this time. So I think, Megan, with that, I will turn it back to you. I'm happy to answer any questions you all might have and any follow-up that there might be after this. We are very much open to. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Kate. That's great information as usual. Really appreciate it. And here's the contact information. That's also really helpful. And I would just say, yeah, if you're listening to this call and you've never heard of Eagle Eye or Gas Buddy or any of those pieces of technology that Kate talked about, certainly reach out to NASEO, reach out to me or Ben. We can help you out with that. But Kate and Brandy are super responsive and they're here to help us. And so they certainly have. Shamika, do we have any questions in the chat?
We do not, Megan. If anyone wants to ask Kate a question, please enter your question into the chat or question pane, or you can raise your hand and I will unmute you.
Great. I know it's getting late on a Friday afternoon. And I'm just trying to think about any relevant questions that I must have. We're going to have all these slides, right, Shamika? These will be posted to the NASEO website?
So we will actually have a recording of the webinar that we'll post to the website after the webinar is over with. And we do have one question from Dan Searforce. As far as cybersecurity, many states have cyber response plans and/or cyber annexes in state emergency response plans. Has DOE worked with any states or FEMA regions on some common understandings of how DOE and federal resources will coordinate and communicate with state agencies for cyber events impacting energy infrastructure in multiple states or regions?
So thank you, Dan, for that question. That's an excellent question. And I think that, there's always more work to do, but, we are trying to at least provide resources as to what we hope that the states are taking into consideration from a cyber perspective. We're also looking at those plans that you all are putting together and trying to glean information from those to help inform the way that, we will plan to respond. I think there's the National Cyber Incident Response Plan, the NSERP, we call it. If you all haven't seen that, we'd be happy to share it. We also are working very closely with the energy sector to identify how our National Cyber Incident Response Plan and how DOE in particular will come into, with our other federal agency partners in the event of any type of cyber incident or cyber attack into a utility, for example. And so really looking at how we can communicate, coordinate with the energy sector as well. And so, obviously it's going to be an intergovernmental, an interagency, and kind of industry government kind of loop that we all need to participate in. And I know there's quite a bit of training that we're looking at. We are trying to continue to update our resources accordingly. But Dan, I'd be happy to kind of talk to you a little bit further about that, because I know that it's a big focus for us in the CSER office and a big focus for you all at the state level.
Yeah, that's a really good question, because I think that is one of the ongoing emergencies that we're having amidst the global pandemic. A lot more phishing attacks and just threats in general to all critical infrastructure. I don't think we've seen anything awful in the energy sector, but I know water utilities in Wisconsin have been receiving, different malware and phishing attacks, and so and with everybody working from home, there's a lot more vulnerabilities. So certainly,
we have a question.
Great.
Oh, sorry.
No, go ahead.
Okay. We have a question from Samesh Arora. How is CSER coordinating cyber response with CISA? CISA?
Yeah. Hi, Samesh. So CISA is the Cybersecurity and Information Security Agency at the Department of Homeland Security. We talk to CISA on a daily basis, and they are actually a big part of the response. At the Department of Energy, we have a very different response function when it comes to cyber incidents. We share information on the threat front with the energy sector on a regular basis, but when it comes to an incident, there are very specific goals very specific outlined authorities that each of the agencies have, and CISA is a big part of that. So we certainly work with them. We try to make sure that they actually have the resources that they need or the training that they need to understand the energy system. We will, plan to be there and make sure that we have subject matter expertise that can be brought to bear in the event of a cyber incident. We actually have developed a memorandum of understanding across the Department of Homeland Security and Cyber Command under Defense. And so really a good unified effort in responding to any cyber incident that may occur in the energy sector. So those are some of the, the different ways we're working with CISA. We have our subsector coordinating councils where those threat briefings are happening. We coordinate on playbooks and, again, ensuring that everybody knows who to contact, knows what that process might look like. But again, I continue to think that there's a lot more work we can do here to ensure that, we can respond to a cyber incident in the same quick and efficient and effective way that we have done for hurricanes. So, we've obviously seen a lot of growth in the hurricane front. We really want to get there on the cyber front. And I think we're really, building the blocks towards the steps to be able to do that. So thank you.
Yeah, really good question.
Great.
Samash's you another one?
No, we do not. I was just going to say, if anyone else had any questions, please enter it in either the chat or the question pane, or raise your hand.
So this is Ben. I actually do have a comment about Eagle Eye, and one of the useful things recently with all the storms, Eagle Eye was really useful and helpful for going back and determining when the peak outages were for the state, so that became a helpful statistic that we needed in making our request for a disaster declaration. It even had a graphing function that showed exactly when the peak was. So that's a useful another use of Eagle Eye that folks may not know, that's very helpful with your emergency management agencies to help them provide that information. So my question was, of course, the operational summary that they used to do with Eagle Eye. Have you heard anything more about that? That helped us have awareness as to what were going on in the states around us, also, and in the country in general with a lot of things. So I just wondered if there was any status update to that.
Yeah, thank you, Ben. I think that Brandy and I had actually reached out to the Eagle Eye team. I know that they had been doing some upgrades, and we're wondering if that was just something that they had lost the linkage to, or if it wasn't something we were doing anymore. So we were trying to still identify that response back to you from our response and recovery team, but we have not forgotten.
Okay, thank you, because yeah, I would provide some of those surrounding states updates during our around the room briefings and to some of our senior leadership from time to time. So thank you.
Sure, and Ben, we do have an Eagle Eye webinar for the NASEO Energy Security group coming up in the very near future. So we should have that update as well as some of the other activities or I guess functions available under Eagle Eye at that time.
Thank you.
I don't see any other questions.
Well, with that, I think we'll thank Kate for another great presentation, and look forward to that Eagle Eye webinar. I think there's always new functionality there, and it's as Ben said, there's things we can use, and these emergencies typically do not stop at our state borders, so it's wonderful to have a regional perspective, and to receive the national overview in terms of the situation reports that you folks send out. So just thanks for all that you do. And thanks to everyone for being on the call, sticking with us late here on a Friday night. Thanks to Shamika and Campbell and David, Terry, Jeff Pillen. It's a pleasure, and we'll look forward to talking to everybody next week, Thursday. We resume the bi-weekly energy security COVID-19 focus calls. And with that, we'll say have a great weekend.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, you too.